No one expected the Chief Justice to lean back, pause, and smile. But Jasmine Crockett had just done the impossible. The air inside the courtroom was electric, charged with something that didn't belong in a place of marble and silence. Even the reporters in the back row stopped typing. Every breath seemed suspended, as if the entire room had been caught mid-thought. It wasn't what she said that froze them. It was how she said it. Moments before, a remark had sliced through the proceedings. Sharp, dismissive, meant to remind her of her place. The kind of comment delivered with a smirk that says, "Decorum protects me, not you." It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. The insult carried the polished venom of someone who'd never been told no. Crockett didn't flinch, she didn't blink. Instead, she leaned forward, eyes locked, voice calm, not a tremor, not a stutter. Every syllable landed with the precision of someone who'd been underestimated too many times and had learned to turn condescension into fuel. "Counsel," she said, her voice smooth as glass, "I suggest you remember that respect is not a courtesy, it's a requirement." A few heads turned. Even Robert's gavel hand paused midair. There was no outrage in her tone, no tremor of anger, just control, the kind that makes arrogance shrink. And for a heartbeat, it felt like time stopped. The room, filled with people who had come expecting another political spectacle, found itself watching something else entirely, dignity answering arrogance with grace, power meeting poise. The man who'd thrown the jab tried to recover with a laugh, the kind meant to erase embarrassment. But it fell flat. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than his defense. Chief Justice Roberts, who'd seen every manner of ego cross his bench, slowly leaned back. There was a flicker in his eyes. Not amusement, but recognition. The kind that says this is different. He wasn't watching a clash of tempers. He was witnessing balance restored. And somewhere, in the tension of that silence, respect began to shift. To understand how the courtroom reached this moment, we need to rewind to the tensions building outside those marble walls. Outside the marble columns of the Supreme Court, cameras flashed like lightning against a gathering storm. The nation was restless, and everyone knew why. The hearing wasn't just another routine debate, it was a reckoning. Questions of justice, race, and representation hung in the air like static. Every headline called it historic, but no one agreed on what history was being written. Inside, the tension carried the weight of centuries. The panel had convened to examine constitutional oversight, an issue dry on paper, but explosive in meaning. At its core lay a challenge to who gets to speak for the law, and who gets silenced beneath it. The stakes weren't just legal, they were moral, cultural, generational. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat poised at her table, the youngest in the room, yet the one whose name had already begun to ripple beyond her district. She'd built her career not through connections, but through confrontation. The kind where truth had to fight to be heard. And in this chamber, that truth was about to collide with power. Across from her sat faces carved from political stone, men and women who had occupied the upper tiers of authority so long they'd mistaken their comfort for correctness. They didn't see her as a peer. Not yet, but they would. Chief Justice John Roberts presided at the center, his expression unreadable. For years he'd been the quiet stabilizer of chaos, dignified, neutral, and often detached. He believed in the sanctity of order, the value of calm amid political firestorms. Yet even he could sense that today's calm was deceptive. Beneath the ceremony of oaths and opening statements, something more volatile was brewing. Crockett adjusted her papers, but her focus was steady. The opposing counsel's words echoed faintly, legal jargon laced with subtle dismissal. She caught it immediately, though she didn't show it. She'd heard this tone before, in classrooms, on campaign trails, in interviews where her every word was dissected before it was even spoken. The tone that asked silently, "Who let you in here?" The irony was that her presence was precisely why the hearing mattered. She wasn't just defending a legal interpretation, She was defending the right to occupy this space without apology. For her, this wasn't theater. It was testimony. Every sentence would carry the weight of a generation that refused to be underestimated. Reporters whispered, sensing the friction before it sparked. On social media, clips of her earlier exchanges had already begun to circulate. Short bursts of confidence, quick flashes of intellect that made her followers swell with pride. To some, she was a symbol of possibility, to others, a threat to the old order. Roberts, meanwhile, sat in his habitual calm, but behind his eyes, calculation stirred. He recognized composure when he saw it, and he recognized danger too. This wasn't the kind of moment that ended quietly. It was the kind that rewrote expectations. He looked at the faces in the room. The restless aides, the eager journalists, the legislators clinging to their talking points. And then at Crockett. There was something about her restraint that disrupted the rhythm of power. It was the kind of quiet that drew attention by refusing to demand it. He wondered if anyone else noticed. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in that courtroom felt it. Something had shifted. The usual hierarchy no longer seemed as certain, the balance of respect no longer preordained. But beneath the polished decorum, an unspoken challenge simmered. And it was about to erupt in full view of the nation. He'd built his reputation on precision, not the kind born from brilliance, but from dominance. Senator Alan Whitmore was the kind of man who spoke in paragraphs and listened in half-sentences. He'd been in Washington long enough to mistake familiarity for wisdom and power for virtue. In every committee, every courtroom, every debate, Whitmore carried the same unshakable certainty that his voice was the one that set the tone. His colleagues called him measured, but what they really meant was untouchable. He had mastered the art of condescension disguised as civility. His questions came wrapped in compliments, his dismissals delivered with a smile. He was never overtly cruel. He didn't need to be. His power came from implication, from the subtle suggestion that he operated on a higher intellectual plane. In this hearing, Whitmore saw opportunity. The media buzzed about Jasmine Crockett. Her sharpness, her composure, her following. She represented everything his generation of lawmakers didn't quite understand, a voice that didn't ask permission. And that unsettled him. Before the session began, he joked with his aides about the freshman firebrand he'd be questioning. They laughed, trading smirks about Twitter politicians and #heroes. Whitmore had no malice in his tone, at least not the kind he could be accused of. But behind the charm was calculation. He knew how to break people down with tone alone. When he spoke, his words carried the rhythm of someone who'd long ago stopped needing to prove himself. Congresswoman Crockett. He began that morning, voice smooth as marble. You've made quite an impression these past few months. Passionate, outspoken, admirable qualities in the right context. The pause that followed was deliberate. He wanted it to sting, but politely. A gentle reminder that she was being evaluated. Crockett met his gaze with that unflinching steadiness that unnerved so many of his kind. She didn't flinch, didn't fidget, didn't fill the silence he left open for her. The stillness itself was defiance. Whitmore pressed on, layering his words with thinly veiled dismissal. He cited obscure procedural points, rhetorical traps, legal phrasing designed to corner her into either hesitation or indignation. It was his usual playbook, one that had silenced many before. But something about her unshaken tone disrupted his rhythm. She didn't match his sarcasm, she dissected it. She didn't raise her voice, she raised her reasoning. And the more she stayed calm, the more his own certainty began to look performative. To those watching, Whitmore still appeared in control. For now. But Roberts saw the shifts in posture, the tightening jaw, the fleeting glance downward when Crockett corrected one of his misstatements with surgical precision. It wasn't open defiance, but it was enough to plant doubt. Whitmore's arrogance wasn't born from hatred. It was from habit. He had built his entire career assuming that confidence and correctness were interchangeable. In every exchange, he expected to win by posture alone, and for decades that had been enough. But Crockett was from a different generation, one that had to fight twice as hard to earn half the recognition. She didn't come to this chamber to impress, she came to be heard. That alone made her dangerous to someone like Whitmore. What unsettled him most wasn't her arguments, it was her poise. She didn't need his approval. She didn't chase validation with every sentence. Every time she spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had already endured worse and refused to bend again. There was a moment, just before the verbal sparring reached its height, when Whitmore caught his reflection in the polished wood of the table, and for a flicker, saw himself as others did, a man clinging to decorum to disguise discomfort. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and doubled down. "Congresswoman, I admire your confidence," he said, voice dipped in honey. "But confidence without deference can sometimes lead to misunderstanding." The remark landed heavy, meant to draw blood quietly. But Crockett only nodded, her lips curving just enough to suggest she'd heard more than he thought he'd said. The silence that followed wasn't weakness. It was judgment. In that stillness, a shift occurred. Whitmore didn't see it yet, but others did. The aides exchanging glances, the quiet tilt of Robert's head, the subtle shift in energy as the balance began to realign. For the first time in a long time, Whitmore wasn't steering the room, he was reacting to it. And as the murmurs began to ripple around the chamber, a faint unease crept into his perfectly measured voice. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was something close. He thought this was just another easy takedown. But Crockett had come prepared, and Roberts was watching closely. Jasmine Crockett learned early that silence was never neutral. Growing up in the thick Texas heat, in a neighborhood where sirens were as common as Sunday hymns, she watched her mother navigate a world that never made room for mistakes. Her mother was a nurse, her father a mechanic. Two people who worked in shifts that rarely overlapped, but who taught her the same lesson in different ways: speak truth, even when it trembles. As a child, Jasmine was the one who asked questions adults didn't want to answer. Why was the playground across town brand new, while theirs was rusting? Why did the neighbors' eviction notices come faster than repairs? Her teachers said she was spirited, which was their polite way of saying she didn't know her place. But that label became her compass. She decided that if the world insisted on giving her a place, she'd make sure it was at the table, not waiting for scraps but drafting the rules. By the time she reached college, the world had already tried to smooth her edges. Professors advised her to tone it down. Mentors warned her to play the game. But Jasmine had already seen too many people lose themselves, trying to fit into spaces never meant for them. So she studied the game, every rule, every precedent, until she knew how to break them with precision. Law school was the crucible. Surrounded by classmates who quoted theory like scripture, Jasmine learned to speak in both dialects, intellect and instinct. She carried herself with a calm so measured that others mistook it for compliance. But beneath that calm was a blueprint of rebellion. Every time a professor ignored her raised hand, she wrote down the question anyway. Every time someone dismissed her as too passionate, she learned how to channel that passion into facts that couldn't be ignored. Her first courtroom case was a pro bono defense. A young man accused of theft for stealing groceries to feed his siblings. Jasmine remembered looking at him and seeing the same wary defiance she'd once seen in her own father after a long shift. When she spoke before the judge, her voice didn't shake. She argued not from pity, but from principle. Justice, she said, shouldn't depend on your zip code or your accent. The ruling came down in her favor, and as the gavel struck, she realized that calm wasn't the absence of fire, it was how you carried it. Her reputation grew, one quiet victory at a time. She became the attorney who didn't need theatrics, who dismantled arguments with precision, who never raised her voice because she never had to. And yet, even as her influence expanded, the world around her stayed turbulent. She watched policies pass that hurt the people she grew up with. She saw faces like hers dismissed as political theater. That's when she turned to Congress, not out of ambition but necessity. When Jasmine Crockett ran for office, pundits called her campaign idealistic. They said she didn't stand a chance against the machinery of Texas politics. But every door she knocked on, every church she visited, every diner conversation she sparked became a reminder there were more people tired of being unheard than the establishment could count. She ran her campaign like a courtroom argument, precise, relentless, unapologetically human, and she won. But victory didn't make her complacent. It made her more dangerous to the status quo. In committee hearings, she was sharp yet measured, confronting injustice not with outrage, but with the discipline of someone who'd studied every angle of oppression. When colleagues talked over her, she waited. When they underestimated her, she took notes. When they disrespected her, she smiled, because she knew what was coming next. Every headline that mocked her tone only amplified her reach. Every attempt to box her in only proved her point. She didn't rise by mimicking the system. She rose by mastering it, reshaping it, and refusing to apologize for existing inside it. And that's what made her so unsettling to people like Senator Whitmore. They mistook her calm for fragility, her courtesy for compliance. They didn't understand that her restraint was armor, forged in every courtroom where she'd had to argue twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. They didn't see the woman who had learned to breathe through disrespect, to translate rage into eloquence, to turn doubt into demonstration. What they saw as silence was, in truth, calculation, a patience that came not from fear but from faith in herself, in justice, in the belief that the truth always comes due. So when Jasmine Crockett entered that courtroom beneath the watchful eyes of marble statues and men who'd never been questioned, she carried with her more than her notes and citations. She carried the weight of stories that never made it into headlines, the voices of those who had been told their anger was unseemly, their ambition misplaced, their presence temporary. And as she sat beneath the gleam of chandeliers and centuries of precedent, her calm wasn't submission. It was the quiet before a storm long overdue. So when she walked into that courtroom, she wasn't just carrying her case, she was carrying every voice told to stay quiet. The room settled into that peculiar kind of silence that hums before impact. Papers shuffled softly, microphones clicked into readiness, and the overhead lights seemed just a shade too bright. Crockett sat still, hands folded, gaze forward. Across from her, Senator Whitmore adjusted his glasses, an unnecessary gesture that masked a flicker of irritation. He'd rehearsed this moment, the one where he would corner her, force her into over-explaining, make her seem emotional in contrast to his measured composure. He leaned into his mic. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, tone dripping with the polish of practiced civility, "you've spoken eloquently about equality before the law. But tell me, do you truly believe passion makes for sound judgment? Because in this chamber, we value reason over rhetoric." A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. It was a question loaded like a spring trap, framed as intellectual but meant to diminish. Passion, rhetoric, the old code words used to domesticate conviction. Crockett didn't move for a full second. Her stillness drew every eye toward her, the kind of pause that forces even the impatient to wait. She tilted her head slightly, her pen balanced between two fingers, its tap so faint it became the metronome of the moment. "Senator," she said evenly, "I'd argue passion is what built every principle this chamber claims to defend. The Constitution wasn't written by the indifferent." Whitmore's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Of course," he said, voice soft, "but passion without restraint can cloud one's interpretation of the law." Crockett nodded, the gesture calm, almost gracious. Then we're fortunate that the law I interpret happens to protect passion, especially the kind that demands justice." The words didn't rise in tone, but they carried weight. A few heads lifted. Even the Chief Justice's eyes flicked upward, a faint acknowledgement of precision. Whitmore shifted his papers again, buying time. He tried another angle. "Perhaps," he said, "though some might say that emotion has no place in jurisprudence." Crockett's reply came swift, surgical. "Emotion built jurisprudence, Senator. Outrage at tyranny, compassion for liberty, regret for injustice. The law was never sterile. It was born from human consequence." The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It vibrated. Robert's brow arched slightly, a signal caught by the journalists in the back who scribbled faster. Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing too late that he'd given her the runway. Crockett continued, her voice steady, but edged with quiet conviction. "What I find concerning isn't passion in the pursuit of justice. It's comfort in the presence of inequality. Passion can be tempered. Complacency cannot." Her words hung there, suspended, daring contradiction. Whitmore's throat tightened as he reached for another question, but it came out smaller than intended. "You're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she cut in, her tone still even, "that the real danger isn't those who care too much. It's those who stopped caring altogether." The tap of her pen ceased. For a moment, no one breathed. The Chief Justice leaned slightly forward, expression unchanged but intent unmistakable. He was listening. Whitmore swallowed, aware that the room had turned. The rhythm he'd controlled at the start had slipped through his fingers, replaced by the steady cadence of a woman who had no need to raise her voice to command the floor. Crockett leaned back, her hands returning to stillness. "You asked about passion, Senator," she said, almost gently. "Where I come from, passion isn't a flaw, it's survival. Without it, there's no reason to stand up, no reason to fight, and certainly no reason to sit in rooms like this and pretend indifference is wisdom." A faint murmur spread, part awe, part disbelief. Whitmore's pen scratched aimlessly across his notes, anything to occupy his hands. The Chief Justice shifted his gavel slightly, not to silence the room, but to acknowledge that something worth hearing had just been said. Crockett glanced up at him then, her eyes steady, her composure untouched. It wasn't defiance. It was confirmation. And for the first time, Robert's famously impassive expression softened, his eyebrow lifting just enough to betray a flicker of respect. Whitmore caught it too. And that was the moment the balance truly shifted. The senator straightened, trying to reassert his authority, but the energy had already left him. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. But no one was ready for what came next. The moment that flipped the power dynamic entirely. Crockett's calm was not stillness. It was strategy. She'd learned long ago that real power doesn't shout. It builds, syllable by syllable, until the room forgets who's supposed to be in charge. Now, that power gathered behind her words like a rising tide. Whitmore cleared his throat again, but it sounded less like authority and more like someone searching for footing on shifting ground. "Congresswoman," he began, his tone tight, "surely you agree that our legal system," she didn't let him finish, "has failed those it was designed to protect." "Yes, Senator, I do agree. It wasn't defiance. It was command, quiet, direct, impossible to interrupt." She leaned forward just slightly, eyes locked on his. "And before you say it's complicated, let me assure you, I understand complication. I practiced it. I lived it." Her words struck with rhythm. No excess, no ornament. Each one measured, deliberate, designed to hit the ear before the mind could form resistance. "When I stood in Texas courtrooms defending clients who couldn't afford bail," she said, "I saw men who'd lost jobs before they'd even been tried. I saw women begging for translators in rooms where no one cared to listen. And every time I heard someone say, 'That's just the system,' I wondered, whose system?" A murmur swept through the gallery, cameras angled closer. Whitmore shifted again, his composure fraying at the edges. Crockett continued, her tone cool but carrying weight. You speak of reason over rhetoric. Yet the very laws we cite were written in the heat of conflict, carved out of passion, not apathy. The founding documents you hold so dear were penned by men aflame with conviction. Passion founded this country. Passion reformed it. And every inch of progress we've made came from someone refusing to stay silent when told to. Whitmore tried to interject, but Roberts lifted a hand slightly. Not a command, merely a gesture of patience. He wanted to hear her finish. Crockett glanced at him briefly, then back at her opponent. I know what makes this chamber uncomfortable, she said. It's not anger. It's not emotion. It's accountability. Spoken in a voice that wasn't expected to have one. Her tone softened, but only slightly. When I was sworn in, I promised to uphold the Constitution, the same document that was once used to justify exclusion, and later used to end it. That's what evolution looks like, Senator. It's not disorder. It's democracy doing what it was meant to do, correcting itself. She paused. The silence stretched, alive with attention. So when you ask if passion clouds judgment, she continued, remember that the abolition of slavery began as passion. Women's suffrage was passion. Civil rights, passion. Every moral correction in American history started with someone who cared too much to stay comfortable. Robert's gaze was fixed now, steady, unblinking. His fingers, resting on the bench, tapped once, not out of impatience but thought. Crockett leaned back slightly, the faintest suggestion of ease. I'm not here to make this room comfortable, she said. I'm here to remind it why it exists. The words rippled through the chamber like a low current. No one moved. Whitmore's practiced smirk was gone. His pen sat forgotten on the desk. Crockett's voice carried on, each word a deliberate incision through the fabric of entitlement. I was taught that law without empathy is tyranny in disguise. That order without justice is just control with better manners. And if that truth feels inconvenient, maybe it's because too many have mistaken silence for respect. A few nods appeared in the audience. Aides, observers, even a few opposing staffers caught in the gravity of the moment. Whitmore tried to recover, to pivot back into theory. But surely, Congresswoman, you wouldn't suggest we legislate based on feelings. Crockett met his question with a calm, so absolute it silenced the rustle of papers. No, Senator. I'm suggesting we legislate with humanity, because when the law forgets the people it governs, it stops being law. It becomes ritual. Her cadence slowed, every word deliberate. And if that ritual demands silence from those who have lived the consequences, then it's not justice. It's theater. That landed. Even Robert's composure flickered. A nearly imperceptible tightening around the eyes, the mark of someone confronted not by defiance, but by truth. Crockett straightened her papers, her movements controlled, purposeful. You said earlier that emotion clouds reason, she said. But what I've seen in every courtroom, every neighborhood I've served, is that detachment clouds compassion. And without compassion, reason becomes cruelty disguised as order. Whitmore exhaled audibly, a sound closer to defeat than to disagreement. Crockett's gaze didn't leave him. You've asked for restraint, she said quietly. So here it is. Restraint is what stops me from asking why the same system that preaches fairness keeps choosing familiarity. Restraint is what keeps me from asking how many of the decisions we call measured are just comfortable. And restraint is what allows me to sit here in this moment and tell you, passion built this country, but apathy will unmake it. The last sentence fell like a verdict. For a long, suspended moment, there was no movement. The lights seemed to hum louder. The cameras held their focus. The air itself waited with recognition. Then, almost imperceptibly, Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward. His gavel didn't drop, but the silence that followed said everything. He looked at Crockett, and something shifted in his expression. Not approval, not applause, but respect. Genuine, unguarded, earned. the kind reserved for those who had spoken not just well, but rightly. Whitmore's face tightened, but even he didn't attempt to reclaim the floor. The hierarchy of the room had redrawn itself, word by word, truth by truth. Crockett gathered her notes, though she didn't need them anymore. Justice, she said softly, almost to herself, isn't about who speaks loudest. It's about who listens when it matters most. Roberts inclined his head once, a silent acknowledgement, brief but unmistakable. The moment held. And when it finally broke, it did so without applause, without ceremony, just the quiet rustle of a room that knew it had witnessed something irreversible. Within minutes, the moment rippled far beyond the courtroom. It started as a murmur, a few tweets, a short clip, a spark flickering in the late afternoon news cycle. Within an hour, it became a blaze. By nightfall, it was an inferno. The video of Jasmine Crockett's exchange spread faster than anyone expected. Not a scandal, not a gaffe, not another shouting match. But something rarer, something people hadn't realized they were starving for: composure under fire. The moment hit social media first. A 42-second clip titled, "Crockett Silences the Room Without Raising Her Voice," rocketed across platforms. On X, the hashtag Crockett moment trended. In less than 30 minutes, viewers weren't just sharing it, they were dissecting it, looping it, quoting it like scripture. One user wrote, "This is what leadership looks like. Calm, sharp, unbothered." Another posted, "We've seen loud men talk for years. Jasmine Crockett just proved silence can roar." Commentators jumped in next. Cable news hosts ran the footage on repeat, slow motioning Roberts' subtle lean forward, breaking down the precise instant the power dynamic shifted. The tone was the same across networks, fascination mixed with awe. Even conservative pundits, usually quick to dismiss rising progressives, couldn't ignore the poise. One commentator on a right-leaning network admitted, "You don't have to agree with her politics to recognize the mastery of that moment." She didn't just win an argument, she controlled the air in that room. Every angle of the footage became part of the discourse. Analysts pointed out the micro-expressions, the tightening of Whitmore's jaw, the widening of Roberts' eyes, the subtle tilt of Crockett's chin. It was cinematic in its restraint. No theatrics, no shouting, just gravity. By the next morning, the Washington Post ran a headline, "Jasmine Crockett redefines the modern hearing: calm, command, and consequence." Across the country, classrooms played the clip in civics discussions. Students who'd never watched a congressional exchange before found themselves quoting her. On college campuses, posters went up with her line, "Law without empathy is tyranny in disguise." It wasn't just a viral soundbite, it was a rallying cry. But virality has its own rhythm, and soon the moment became more than news. It became symbol. Editorials described it as the silence heard around the country. Podcasts analyzed it as a cultural inflection point where dignity outperformed outrage. Even late-night hosts weighed in, joking that Whitmore's silence might be the first bipartisan moment in years. Meanwhile, inside Washington, reactions were sharper. Some lawmakers admired her control but feared what it meant. A new archetype of authority, unbothered by the old guard's dominance. Others whispered about how she'd played to the cameras. Yet even they couldn't deny the shift. The footage had reached voters who hadn't watched a hearing in their lives. Crockett herself stayed silent through it all. No press tour, no self-congratulation. When reporters asked for comment, she only said, "It was a hearing, not a performance. The law deserves our best, not our loudest." That line alone trended again, because authenticity travels farther than spectacle. The cultural echo was unmistakable. Community leaders replayed the exchange in town halls. Civil rights groups called it a blueprint for modern advocacy. Young girls, especially from marginalized communities, began tagging videos with her initials and the phrase, "Composure is power." Even Roberts' role in the moment drew fascination. Clips of his quiet acknowledgement, the faint nod, the subtle pause, were interpreted as symbolic, Editorial boards called it a gesture of overdue respect, a rare glimpse of grace in a system often defined by condescension. Whitmore, on the other hand, vanished from the spotlight. His office released a single, sterile statement: "The senator appreciates the opportunity for civil discourse." It only amplified the contrast. A man hiding behind decorum while a woman embodied it. By week's end, the clip had been viewed over 20 million times. News anchors began using Crockett moment as shorthand for any instance of dignified defiance. When a teacher stood up to unfair policy or a student spoke truth to power, the comment sections echoed by Crockett moment. But the most telling reaction came not from pundits or politicians, but from ordinary people. One viral post showed a grandmother in Detroit watching the video with her granddaughter. The caption read, "I told her, this is what strength looks like. Not yelling, not anger, just knowing who you are." Across the country, people who'd long felt dismissed saw themselves in Crockett's steadiness. They saw proof that dignity wasn't passivity. It was precision. That justice didn't need to shout. It just needed to stand firm long enough to be heard. The nation had seen countless confrontations before, but this one felt different. Not because it was louder, but because it was quieter. The kind of quiet that lingers. The kind that demands reflection. And as the news cycle churned, one image kept returning. Roberts' measured nod, the gavel untouched, the pause that echoed louder than applause. But what mattered most wasn't the virality. It was what John Roberts did next. The next morning, the courtroom didn't feel like the same place. The marble columns stood as they always had, unflinching and pale, but there was something different in the air, an undercurrent of quiet reverence. Even the staffers moved a little slower, as though aware they'd witnessed something that would outlive the day's docket. When Chief Justice Roberts entered, there was no announcement, no theatrics. Yet the room straightened. The sound of chairs settling filled the silence before he spoke. His gaze found Crockett, and for the first time in memory, the measured neutrality in his eyes softened. He adjusted his papers, cleared his throat, and said simply, "Before we begin today's proceedings, I wish to acknowledge the importance of yesterday's exchange." The room froze. It wasn't protocol. Roberts didn't offer commentary. Ever. He continued, each word deliberate. "Civility," he said, "is often mistaken for submission. But what we witnessed was something truer. Conviction restrained by respect." His tone carried neither favor nor apology, only gravity. This institution depends on the integrity of those willing to speak truth within its bounds. Yesterday reminded us why these walls were built, not to contain conflict, but to dignify it. The remark was brief, but it landed with the weight of history. Crockett didn't move, didn't smile. Her face held the same composed focus as always. But those who knew her well, the aides, the allies, the quiet supporters, saw it. The faintest nod, the almost imperceptible breath of relief. Not victory, not triumph, validation. Roberts shifted his gaze across the room, pausing on Whitmore. "Debate," he said, "is the mechanism by which a democracy breathes. But it requires both lungs, passion and discipline." The message was clear. It wasn't rebuke, not entirely. It was a recalibration. That moment rippled outward faster than any ruling could. Commentators replayed it in awe. The Chief Justice, usually a pillar of detachment, had spoken not as a jurist, but as a custodian of principle. His acknowledgement reframed the entire episode. It wasn't just a viral exchange, it was a reclamation of purpose. For years, Americans had grown accustomed to spectacle, shouting matches disguised as hearings, point scoring masked as governance. But here was something else. A glimpse of what discourse could look like when anchored in grace. Crockett's restraint, once dismissed as timidity by critics, was suddenly seen for what it was: strength distilled to its purest form. And Roberts' recognition of that strength wasn't just a gesture, it was an institutional echo of the nation's conscience saying, "Enough." In the days that followed, an editorial in The Atlantic captured it best. The courtroom did not need to applaud. Respect once earned resounds in silence. Back in Texas, Crockett's constituents spoke of pride. Not partisan pride, but human pride. The feeling of being represented by someone who carried their story with dignity. A local pastor told his congregation, "When she stood her ground without losing her grace, she reminded us that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest." The resonance went deeper than politics. It touched something elemental. The collective fatigue of a country tired of shouting, aching for steadiness. People began to speak about the moment as if it had reset the moral compass of the chamber itself. And for Roberts, who had spent decades guarding the sanctity of procedure, it was a reminder that rules are only as noble as the hearts that follow them. That justice, in its truest form, is not loud or partisan, it's composed. As the hearing resumed, the sound of papers turning felt almost ceremonial. Words carried new weight. Even Whitmore, humbled, listened more than he spoke. Crockett glanced once toward the bench, meeting Robert's eyes. There was no exchange of words, no smile, no signal, just a mutual acknowledgement that something rare had occurred. Respect had crossed the aisle. And for one fleeting moment, the marble walls didn't feel cold. They felt alive, echoing with the quiet certainty that dignity, when tested, can still prevail. In that stillness, a rare thing happened. Respect crossed the aisle. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the silence lingered like a melody that refused to fade. Crockett gathered her papers with the same calm she had carried through every moment of the hearing. The kind of calm that wasn't absence of fire, but mastery of it. Behind her, Chief Justice Roberts remained seated for a moment longer, eyes following her as if weighing not her argument, but her presence. Then, almost imperceptibly, he gave a single nod, a quiet salute from one guardian of order to another. That image would replay endlessly, the nod, the stillness, the unspoken recognition. It wasn't a handshake or a headline. It was something rarer. Mutual respect in a world addicted to noise. Outside, cameras waited for quotes, for confrontation, for chaos. But Crockett offered none. She simply said, "I came here to speak truth, not to win a moment." And somehow that humility made the moment even larger. The clip faded to black, the courtroom, the faces, the quiet applause that followed. And then the narration returned, steady and reflective. In an age that rewards outrage, composure is rebellion. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout to be heard. She listened until silence became her weapon. And in doing so, she reminded a divided country of something simple. Respect isn't demanded, it's demonstrated. A soft piano note carried the closing line. If you believe composure can conquer chaos, share this moment, because sometimes the most powerful sound in America is silence.